Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, filmmaker, comedian, bookender.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah, because we're bookending this season right now.
We are indeed. We have spent a whole season talking about the films of 1967, the furthest back in film history we've yet to look.
Yeah, you have been pushing us. You say we got to go back further and further, and I said, okay.
Yeah, I'm like Jack on Lost. We have to go back.
Yeah, yeah, you are. So.
I think we had a lot of fun talking about this year in film. We had a lot of interesting, varied choices, and really we're looking at the way that this was a transitional year for cinema. But of course, as always, there's tons and tons of movies that we didn't talk about. And so in this epilogue, as we typically do, we're going to take a look at our different categories, what other options we might have had, and some suggestions from you, our listeners, who, if you listen to our audience choice episode, Jason hates.
I love you guys. I've calmed down. I've talked to my therapist since then, and I might have gone a little too far.
That's it's passion is what we like here. So we started off with the box office champion of 1967, which was The Graduate, and some of the other top grossing films of 1967. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Sidney Poitier, of course, a huge, huge star in 1967. Quite a year for him. Bonnie and Clyde, a major turning point film in cinema. The Dirty Dozen. Valley of the Dolls, huge hit in 1967. To Sir with Love, another Sidney Poitier film. And the sort of more typical blockbuster kind of film, You Only Live Twice, the James Bond film with Sean Connery, which may still come up.
Spoiler alert, we did it as an extra episode for the Patreon, so you can hear it on Dave's Patreon. What is that?
The Produced by David Rosen Patreon coming next week.
Yeah. And also it eventually will end up in the feed here.
Yeah, we will. But that's our little bonus as we've been doing each season. So for the patrons, if you've signed up for that, you can hear our thoughts on James Bond and You Only Live Twice.
You only live twice. I don't even know
and
if that was
unfortunately you can hear Jason sing that again.
Did you have a favorite in that list that we didn't cover?
No, I've never seen The Dirty Dozen or I've seen Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Because Ebert wrote that one?
Because Ebert wrote it, the sequel, which is crazy. It's my happening and it's freaking me out.
Yeah, Josh did an impression.
Amazing.
And I haven't seen To Serve with Love or anything, or Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, in fact. So it's hard for me to pick a favorite. Actually, of those, the only one I've seen is Bonnie and Clyde, which is, of course, great.
Masterpiece.
Yeah.
Guess Who's Coming to Dinner I've seen, and you should watch that.
Yeah.
And I'll watch To Sir with Love with you one day. So I've never seen that, but yeah.
That also has a famous song by Lulu.
Yeah, I could try to approximate that, but I'm not.
Yeah, we probably should.
Yeah,
let's move on.
Let's move on, Josh. Maybe the toughest category to pick, even though we kind of knew who we were going to pick. This one had a lot of great choices. First feature, and it's pretty cool that so many directors had their first feature in 1967. We went with Who's That Knocking at My Door, not to be confused with the awful Paul McCartney song, Someone Knocking at My Door, Go On, Let Them In, right? We liked Who's That Knocking at My Door, and I think we really liked how it showed just how many themes Martin Scorsese would continue to play with throughout his storied career. The Producers was on that list, which we did cover, Dave's pick later. One, we were going to do another comedy, Enter Laughing. I've never seen Carl Reiner, but I think Carl Reiner is a little underrated for everything he did in the entertainment field. You don't necessarily think of him as a director, even though he did The Jerk and everything. You think of him as more of like an omnipresence in comedy, right? To do everything. Good Times, William Friedkin. I've never seen that. Have you?
No. A lot of these, I think, were these famous directors where their first films were ones that were not all that well known.
Yeah. So we have Poor Cow, which I thought was, and it might have been like a 66 released in 67. That's Ken Loach. And the reason I knew that movie, and I think you knew that movie, is because The Limey, Steven Soderbergh's movie, takes footage from Poor Cow and kind of moves it into The Limey and kind of tells that story.
I didn't realize that. I mean, I know Ken Loach, and I think I've seen one or two other Ken Loach films, but I had not recalled that about The Limey.
I'm pretty sure that's the case, unless there's a movie called Brown Cow that I just confused it with.
All right.
But I'm almost positive that's what happened.
Great.
Mark Rydell had a good career. We were going to look at the Fox. And then Melvin Van Peebles, who we should cover at some point in time, his importance, especially as a blaxploitation director. His first movie, The Story of a 3-Day Pass.
And that movie actually just recently has gotten a major restoration and a theatrical release again. So it's been revived and has gotten renewed attention.
Is that, did they put it on Criterion recently?
I don't believe it is. It may be eventually. Criterion is releasing a box set, a physical box set of Melvin Van Peebles' first 4 films, which will include that. And a lot of times that stuff eventually ends up on the streaming service, but I don't think it's there yet. So
turns out Jason's right about the Limey, by the way.
Oh,
yeah,
I'm
the man.
I just didn't remember that about it. I mean, I've seen the Limey, but that's pretty cool. And
well, I'm here to educate Josh.
speaks to Soderbergh's deep knowledge of film history.
Yeah, the just to that Terrence Stamp character is that character in the Limey.
Oh, okay. Yeah, interesting. So yeah, and you brought up Mark Rydell, and not only had I not heard of the Fox, I had never heard of Mark Rydell.
There you go.
So shows my lack
he
of
didn't.
knowledge.
He didn't win.
No, he didn't.
Didn't he do on Golden Pond?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think I just looked him up before this, and he had made a bunch of notable films, but none that I've seen. And his name I think he made films, and maybe he wasn't as known as an auteur, but just had someone who worked steadily.
If I'm not mistaken, he might have also been a major theater presence in the 60s in that New York scene. So
yeah,
it's tough to sometimes quantify how much of an influence people had in the overall field of entertainment.
that is true, but we try. So our box office flop was, I think, fascinating, and a film that Jason brought to our attention that I had missed out on initially. It was Charlie Chaplin's final film, A Countess from Hong Kong, with Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. And only a couple other options that we talked about. Dr. Dolittle, which was actually weirdly an Oscar nominee, but is one of these giant, expensive productions that didn't really make its money. And Elvis Presley in Clambake.
Yeah, that would have been interesting, Clambake. I don't really necessarily need to ever see Dr. Dolittle unless I'm like, I have to watch all the rest of the Best Picture noms. But Clambake would be interesting because it's, that Elvis and Frankie and Annette stuff of the 60s, that beach blanket bingo party, Blue Hawaii stuff. So I don't know if I would want to start there, not knowing that much about that genre, but like I think would have been worthy to cover. Although Countess of Hong Kong, yeah, what a misguided effort all the way around.
Yeah, but a fascinating one. So yeah, and I think, Elvis made so many movies and was such a massive pop culture presence that's definitely something we might want to look at some point. I'm sure Clambake isn't very good though.
Well, we can pick a different one.
Yeah.
The Palme d'Or winner was Blow Up, Michelangelo Antonioni, and what it did was confuse all of us.
That it did.
We watched it and said, when is something going to happen? And do you know when it happened?
Never.
Maybe never.
Occasionally, a little bit. Yeah.
It is regarded as one of the great films of all time, even if it wasn't for us. Why don't you tell us what else was up in Cannes that year?
Okay. Well, yeah, weirdly, like, as much as we were baffled by Blow Up, it was by far the most well-known film in Cannes. So I noted down some other stuff, but honestly, I never heard of any of these. But in terms of like sort of known directors, Joseph Luzzi directed a Harold Pinter adaptation called Accident. I know, Jason, you know some Pinter stuff,
I do like Harold Pinter. Yes, quite a bit. Excellent playwright. And I've gotten to act in some of his stuff, not in the Pinter level, but in college and everything.
Yeah.
And,
are you familiar with that play, Accident?
I am not.
All right. Well, that was a film.
He's an awesome writer, Harold Pinter.
Yeah. Robert Bresson, who's a major French filmmaker, had a film called Mouchette. There was an adaptation of James Joyce's Ulysses, directed by Joseph Strick, who I'm not familiar with.
Wow. How do you even adapt Ulysses?
I think probably very loosely.
Yeah.
A Francis Ford Coppola film that I've never heard of called You're a Big Boy Now.
That's his first movie that he ever directed based on a script that he wrote, which is an adaptation from a novel. But that is an important movie because at this point in time, as we talked about, the old studio guard was there, and guys like Coppola were not getting through. He was the first film school brat, so to speak, to make a movie. And like, that's why he was so revered by Lucas, Spielberg, all these guys like that. I've never seen it, but it's an important movie we should watch sometime.
All right. Yeah, I never heard of it, but that's a whole interesting background there. And the Best Director award went to a Hungarian filmmaker whose name I will mispronounce, Ferenc Koza, for a film called 10,000 Days. So I think we were lucky to end up with Blow Up.
I don't know. I do like 10,000 Maniacs with Natalie Merchant.
Probably not the same thing.
Oh, okay. Josh, we did documentaries. We really only had two choices, I feel like. Don't Look Back, which was the right choice, I think. We had to do Pennebaker. And I think it's very important that we once again mention, like in this year of moving cinema forward, how much he helped move cinema forward, not just with this verite fly on the wall look, but also with the equipment that he created and the Maisels and, you know, all them created, with giving them the access to shoot on the run and in the moment and be that fly on the wall. I like Don't Look Back. I had never seen it. I'm a big music documentary fan. I know you're not, but I think you definitely saw the worth in us watching that one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I did like it. I didn't love it. And as we've now talked about multiple times, I'm just kind of, music documentaries don't really do much for me, but I think you're absolutely right with how influential and important that film is. And there's a lot in it that I found entertaining.
Good. The other one was Titicut Follies, and I have heard of it, but I don't know much about it. I think you know more about that than I do.
Well, it's Frederick Wiseman's first film, so we could have also had that as a debut. And he, as much as Pennebaker, is a massively influential documentary filmmaker, still working.
He was a huge last year. He had a very acclaimed piece last year.
Yeah, City Hall, and he's known for these verite films, fly on the wall kind of things. Titicut Follies about a institution for the criminally insane, and the title refers to a talent show put on by the workers there. So I'm sure a fascinating film.
Yeah, that City Hall last year it's supposed to be amazing. It's like 4.5 hours long, but I wonder if Titicut Follies like led to some reforms and everything, because these type of films often would lead to reforms of underserved or communities that are not served the right way.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, if we had talked about it, we would have looked into all of that stuff, but it's certainly an influential film.
Yeah, that would have definitely been a good one to choose, but I'm glad we did Don't Look Back.
Absolutely. That was obviously the right choice.
And then came your pick, Josh.
What? Yeah, so my pick was Point Blank. And do you want to do your bad Lee Marvin impression one more time? That's a lovely note to retire that impression on. And really, at the time we were putting this together, that was like my only thought. And actually, right before we did this season, just randomly from Netflix, I watched a 1967 film called Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn and Alan Arkin.
Where Alan Arkin's the menacing bad guy.
And he's so good as this bad guy in a kind of role that I had never seen him in. And Audrey Hepburn is this blind woman who's being menaced by these criminals. And it's a really tense thriller. And after watching it, I thought maybe I'll pick that instead. And I'm happy that I went with Point Blank, but Wait Until Dark is great.
Good. Yeah, I would like to see Wait Until Dark. And I'm glad we saw Point Blank because, again, the way that Borman's playing with the form and everything, and also Lee Marvin. I just leave Marvin, but Josh, like, was there a bigger star in the 60s? It was like him and Portier, and towards the end, Redford and guys like that.
Yeah, he was a massive star at that point, and I loved Point Blank, as we said. Even watching it the second time, I think I liked it even more. Our foreign film pick was Jean-Luc Godard's Weekend, which is another one that really baffled us.
Ooh, but I will always remember that over 4-minute tracking shot of all the accidents in the highway and everything like that.
Yeah, some amazing craftsmanship in that film, even if all the messaging kind of lost us. So a lot of great potential choices. Another French film, Le Samouraï, from Jean-Pierre Melville, who was sort of a proto New Wave director, influential on a lot of the French New Wave filmmakers. And I haven't seen that one, but I've seen a couple of his other films, a lot of crime films that he made, and he's incredibly talented. We thought about The Fireman's Ball from Milos Forman, which, Jason, I think you and I watched in our old film club with Tony Macklin.
Yeah, I want to revisit it. We did watch that. But when we talked about the Czech New Wave, when we talked about Kolya in 96, we kind of referenced back to this time. And the humor that they found in all these serious movies or serious themes with a lot of humor. So this was another one of those big comedy pieces with like a more serious theme.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it was one of those things where there's a lot of cultural specificity that maybe we wouldn't have gotten, but I remember liking it when we saw it. We also mentioned Dragon Inn from King Hu, which is a classic Taiwanese martial arts film. I Am Curious Yellow, the Swedish erotic drama, which I think was known at the time maybe more for its eroticism, but is I think also a serious film.
Like Rochelle.
Kind of like, I think Rochelle is sort of a parody of those kinds of films. And you brought up, Jason, a film that I had never heard of, a Soviet film called Kidnapping Caucasian Style.
Yeah, it just seemed interesting, and we haven't gotten to Russia yet. And we know there's such a bleakness in their cinema that we have to get there eventually, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that maybe was a little too obscure, but I'm sure we'll get to a Russian film at some point. So then we got to your pick.
Yeah, my pick was Cool Hand Luke. And I think I picked it for two reasons. One, I'm platonically in love with Paul Newman. But even if I was romantically in love with Paul Newman, I think that would be acceptable, other than that he's dead and it wouldn't go anywhere. But I keep saying it, like my top line of actors, he's right there, along with like Duvall, De Niro. There's a few others, right? But I love him. He's amazing, and I will watch anything he does. And I remember seeing it, and I hadn't seen it since the first time I watched it. So I'm glad we revisited it, and I thought it brought up a lot of important things. So the others I was looking at, Barefoot in the Park, which we literally just talked about on our last episode. I've never seen, but Redford you always want to watch, and Neil Simon. Dirty Dozen, iconic film, and that one's also passed me by, so I should watch that. The Tiger Makes Out and The Busybody. I didn't really know these movies until we started researching. The Tiger Makes Out is an Arthur Hiller movie, and he is I don't know, where do you place Arthur Hiller as a director? Because he's done so many comedies that did so well, but no one ever like considers him like a major figure, right?
Yeah, he's not really considered like an auteur. I think he's more of a journeyman figure, you know, who was able to do a lot of different things and just come in and be professional. And we talked a little bit about that with Norman Jewison when we talked about In the Heat of the Night and how many movies he'd made and how many different genres, but he wasn't necessarily thought of as this great auteur.
I think Jewison is considered a level above, you know, much like Rob Reiner, same type of thing, Josh. But I thought that would have been interesting. The Busybody, the reason I would have chose that's a Sid Caesar movie, and Sid Caesar, so famous for Your Show of Shows, never really translated on film his talent. And I thought it would have been interesting to see that. Although in Grease, right, I think that was like his last big part when he was the coach or something. But he's so talented. I wanted to see what this was all about. Why didn't it work? Or did it work? Maybe, I don't know. Now, Josh, you did mention one movie earlier that going back, I'm glad we picked Cool Hand Luke, but I would add to my list, and we might have to do it at some point, Bonnie and Clyde. I literally rewatched it last night and this morning just to make sure I was right. And I am right. That is a 5-star movie.
Yeah.
It's a masterpiece and as important as anything to come out in this year. And it's so good.
We may have a chance to revisit that one in the future. We're figuring some things out.
But do you agree that is an amazing movie?
Yeah, I mean, I did not obviously watch it yesterday, so my memories are a little fuzzier. But I mean, I have seen it, and it is fantastic, and certainly influential. And in terms of that theme that we keep talking about for this season of the transition into sort of new Hollywood, that's the most important one.
There's so much we'll get to talk about. Have you seen that, Dave?
I haven't. I'd love to.
Yeah. So I hope we get to cover it. It's great. It's great. And, you know, as someone who just talked about Paul Newman as an actor, right? Like, I think Beatty, Hackman, Faye Dunaway, and Estelle Parsons won the Oscar for this one. Like, they're all probably at their best here.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to revisit that. So we talked about the Golden Lion winner at the Venice Film Festival, because, of course, there's no Sundance in 1967, which is typically what we cover. So the Venice winner was Belle de Jour, another semi-baffling film that I think worked better for us than Blow Up or Weekend. We all enjoyed more. Like Cannes, Venice was full of a bunch of movies that I had never heard of this year. But on the more recognizable level, La Chinoise by Jean-Luc Godard, one of his 3 films in 1967, as we talked about in that Weekend episode. Luchino Visconti made an adaptation of Albert Camus' The Stranger, another difficult to adapt novel, but he tried. And Pier Paolo Pasolini had an adaptation of Oedipus Rex. So those are some of the in competition films at Venice that Beldiger beat out.
You want to shout out to your mom? Since you
For what
mentioned
reason? Oedipus Rex. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think she's seen any of these movies. I do not. Thank you for that weird, uncomfortable opportunity, though.
Okay. Well, as you remember, I did mention your mom in the Graduate episode, but
lovely stuff here. Back. Yeah.
Let's talk about The Graduate because it was a nominee for the Best Picture. We had already covered it, and it did not win Best Picture. We covered instead In the Heat of the Night, which did win Best Picture, which you love, and I think is a very strong film. And of course, two great performances from Sidney Poitier and Amanda going like this, talking like that, Josh. You like that? You like that right there?
Yeah,
Rod Steiger.
Rod Steiger, right? Could also be George Kennedy from.
Now, Josh, that boy talk up here like this. Rod Steiger a little low down here like this. All right. What else was up, Josh? Bonnie and Clyde, we just talked about, and that honestly is my favorite of the bunch. Dr. Dolittle, none of us saw. The Graduate, we talked about. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? I would watch that one again. I would like to watch that again.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that list is that these are all movies that are either kind of very forward-thinking stylistically or take on these serious social issues, and then you have Dr. Dolittle. So it's this very weird outlier there among those nominees.
Let me just reiterate this Best Actor category that Steiger won for, right?
Yeah.
Steiger, Warren Beatty, Dustin Hoffman, Paul Newman, Spencer Tracy. Put it up against any year.
Amazing. So then we talked about Dave's pick, which was the producers. Did you have any other ideas there, Dave?
I only had one other because obviously my cinematic knowledge starts to go away as we get this far back. But in the lead up to this year's wonderful Godzilla vs. Kong, I watched a whole bunch of kaiju movies leading up to it. And one of them from the director of the original Godzilla was King Kong Escapes, which is actually pretty damn fun, but I'll save our King Kong discussions for either 1933 or 2005 one of these days.
All right. Yeah. I remember when you brought up that we might talk about that. I thought that would have been fun. And of course, as we established, I don't really like the producers.
Yeah.
So I would have enjoyed talking about that King Kong movie, but we had a good chat about it.
Yeah, I think all's fair in love and war in King Kong, Dave.
That's right.
Godzilla vs. Kong, by the way, Dave's number one film of 2021 thus far.
You bet your ass it is.
Of course, it means nothing because Malcolm and Marie is his number two film, thereby negating any of his opinions for this year. Let's move on to our future cult classic, Josh. We chose The Trip, and I'm so glad we did. We got into Roger Corman. We had the great conversation with a Corman acolyte, a member of the Corman Academy, Francisco Menendez, who kind of really helped us contextualize what the importance of it was. And I think what we learned a little more for ourselves was Corman, not just this massive producer, but really a skilled director and an interesting film, if not a great film.
Right. No, I agree. And I had seen a number of Corman films that he's directed. And I think every time I'm newly impressed with that because he has this reputation of just producing all this B-movie schlock, but he was quite a talented director, and I would recommend going and seeing other films that he directed in the 60s there.
I would like to. And he talks very softly with pauses in between. Other picks, Josh, you mentioned Valley of the Dolls. We looked at that, right? President's Analyst, that was one you had brought up.
Yeah, weird. I haven't seen it, but film about the psychiatrist to the president. It's got some weird political satirical stuff.
Comedy stuff.
Yeah, right? With James Coburn as the analyst of the president, who may come up again. His name.
Yeah, James Coburn doing work.
Yeah.
Mad Monster Party, which I think is one of those monster movies.
It's a Rankin Bass animated movie actually with the monsters.
Whoa.
Featuring Boris Karloff, his voice work.
Well, that's got to be just wild, right?
Yeah, I think I haven't seen it, but it sounded wild and I was curious about
it.
And
I think I had mentioned Hell's Angels on Wheels, which I'm glad we didn't do. Is that probably just like, hey, Wild Angels, Corman 66, this is another film like that?
I think it is kind of that, like, bikers are a thing, let's make them into a movie.
Yeah, so that one with the Wild Angels is the one to watch for that.
Yeah, I am kind of curious to watch Mad Monster Party someday.
That does sound cool.
Sound pretty
Me
crazy.
too.
So our audience choice that Jason hated was How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. And that was choosing among stage to screen adaptations that also included Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park with Robert Redford and The Taming of the Shrew with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. Other categories we looked at, James Bond had quite a year in 1967. So as we said, we did end up doing a bonus episode on the actual James Bond film, You Only Live Twice.
You only live twice.
Which you can look for on the Patreon and unfortunately hear Jason sing that. That was Sean Connery's, at the time, final turn as James Bond before he ended up coming back.
Kind of walking through it at times.
Yeah. But also in 1967 was the film Casino Royale, which was technically based on Ian Fleming's James Bond novel via the complicated rights to James Bond that existed then, but was made as a parody of James Bond films with a whole bunch of David Niven, the main Bond in that film, but also Peter Sellers and Woody Allen. And I actually watched it and it is terrible. So I'm kind of glad we didn't talk about it.
Now, I'm wondering, Josh, do you think, like with How to Succeed in Business, you guys argued like that the satire worked, and for me, it just felt like totally outdated. Do you think this did this just fall out dating wise, or
it was a failure at the time? I don't think anyone liked it then, and I don't think anyone likes it. I mean, it has a small cult following, but I think it was just a misfire from start to finish.
Cool.
And speaking of James Coburn, In Like Flint, which was the second in the series of James Bond parodies that starred James Coburn, also came out in 67. So interesting sort of lineup of Bond films. We also talked about maybe an Elvis Presley category, as we mentioned, Clambake, but he also had two other 67 films, Easy Come, Easy Go, and Double Trouble, neither of which are particularly well known or that I've seen. So maybe for Elvis, again, better to start with something else.
Jailhouse Rock or whatever.
Yeah. Viva
now,
Las Vegas.
the one I wanted to do was musicians who act, because that trend, which I guess we're really seeing again now, of, we know someone's a good singer, so they must be a good actor, right? Comes to a number of films in 1967. Tony Rome with Frank Sinatra. I think Nancy Sinatra actually sang the theme song to that.
In addition to singing the theme song to You Only Live Twice?
Yeah, she was doing a lot back then.
Good year for theme songs.
Yeah, but Frank Sinatra, we know, can act, obviously.
Yes.
Great in Ocean's 11 and From Here to Eternity. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Good Times with Sonny and Cher. Cher won an Oscar for Moonstruck. Directed by
Norman Jewison.
Right. So that was in the 80s. And then one of my all-time favorite singers, I wonder, I've never seen him act, but I love him. I love his voice. Greatest voice in rock and roll, pure voice ever. The fastest guitar alive, Roy Orbison.
Yeah, and those, I mean, maybe interesting, but I think we realized that nobody's heard of any of those movies. So
I would have liked, like this kind of trend of like Westerns with singers. Didn't Bob Dylan do some, they were all offered movies like this?
Yeah,
right?
well, Bob Dylan is in Sam Peckinpah film, that I can't remember the name, that we also watched with Tony Macklin in Film Club. And he has a supporting role.
Not
in that
Straw
film.
Dogs.
No. A Western.
Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
Yeah, I've
Pat
never
Garrett
seen
and
that
Billy.
one,
Oh,
so,
okay.
yeah.
I think we watched it. Maybe you weren't there. We watched it with
No.
Tony Macklin, was one of his favorites.
Yeah, that nobody knows what you're talking about. We used to have a film club. We've mentioned it here.
Yeah, we've
We would
mentioned it
watch
a bunch of
movies
times. Tony
and,
Macklin, brilliant critic.
Yeah, and it's nice to always mention him.
Yeah.
But I would like to watch The Fastest Guitar alive one day. Of those three, that would have been the one I would have picked.
Yeah.
What would you have picked if we had gone that way?
I don't know. I mean, I think my issue again there was that, like, I don't really know. There's none of those are really all that notable. So I don't know much about them. But I think of those, I mean, Orbison is not known as an actor, and that's probably maybe would have been more interesting because he didn't do more. I mean, Sinatra, as you said, had a pretty decent sized acting career, and Cher too. So to see Roy Orbison and how he worked as an actor might have been interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And also Sonny Bono, we know from the variety show, could play comedy. So that would have been, to see them on film might have been fun also.
Yeah, maybe eventually. So as always, we asked our wonderful listeners on social media what movies from 1967 you are interested in. And we did talk about a lot of them. So, but in terms of movies that we didn't talk about, Scott David Johnson, Jason's a good friend and writing partner, had a lot of suggestions, including Casino Royale and The Dirty Dozen, and To Sir With Love. He also mentioned Camelot, which was one of the stage-to-screen adaptations that we ended up not including in our choices.
Why didn't we include that?
Because it's 3 hours long.
That's
and
a
we
good
didn't want to
reason.
watch it. but it's, it's a notable musical. He also mentioned The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which of course is an iconic Western, and Merit Sade, another stage adaptation about the Marquis de Sade that I was not familiar with at all. But that's.
I bet it's spicy though.
And no, his list went on. He also
research, Scott.
Thoroughly Modern Millie, another musical. And Valley of the Dolls, and a few others too. There, he really loaded us up with suggestions.
He Joe Blacked us.
Yeah, he did. We didn't get anything from Joe Black this time.
Usually, Joe's the guy who just mentions every movie of the year.
The Citizen Kane Versus podcast, thank you, on Twitter suggested Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Our good friend Victoria Ribeiro suggested Valley of the Dolls, and that totally seems like a movie that Victoria would enjoy. Greg Carson also, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And another dedicated listener, Ian Zeitzer, likes In Like Flint. So
yeah,
Ian Zeitzer. Sorry, Ian. So thank you to everyone for your suggestions. And again, a lot that we kind of mentioned and others that we covered that I didn't bring up there. But hopefully we offer people some interesting stuff from this year.
Yep. And at some point in the future, we might get back to one or two of them. But not next season, Josh.
Well, Jason, do you want to give our listeners the announcement of what we're going to do next season?
Next season is actually the reason we started Awesome Movie Year, if you want the truth. Many regard it as the greatest movie year of all time. That's also true, right? We're going to do it. The reason we held off this long is because I think it's been covered in other podcasts. Literally, there's a podcast that covers every movie that was ever made in this year. But we're going to do it in our way. It's Awesome Movie Year 1999 for season 9.
And we're going to start off, as always, with the box office champ. Although, as we've done a couple times, we're actually going to look at the number 2 movie at the box office. So what is going to be our first episode?
It's going to be The Sixth Sense, which, of course, does not have a catchphrase that people repeated over and over again. M. Night Shyamalan, a controversial filmmaker.
Yeah. Yeah, to say the least. So that's our 1967 season. And that's this episode of Awesome Movie Year. Check us out on social media.
Do it. AwesomeMovieYear.com. Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram. Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter. JasonHarrisComedy.com is not a website that I own, but you still own. Jason Harris Comedy on Facebook and Instagram. J Harris Comedy on Twitter. Go for Jason. That's a website I should also give up.
My website, also barely hanging on, JoshBellHatesEverything.com. Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook, and Signal Bleed on Twitter. And listen to our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. Join that Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces. And don't forget about the Patreon produced by David Rosen with bonus content from Piecing It Together, Awesome Movie Year, and my music career.
Not Food and Loathing, my other podcast about the food scene. But I just wanted to plug that. Dave, can we see the new movie that you made anywhere?
Not yet, but as soon as we can, you guys will be the first to know about it.
All right.
Yeah. So as we said, check out the Patreon for our bonus episode on You Only Live Twice, and tune in next time.
1999. We're going to party like it's 1999. I think of every season. We're all very excited for this season coming up.
We are, and we hope you are too. So tune in next time for The Sixth Sense, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.